It was April 12, 1945. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who had led the nation for 12 years, the architect of the New Deal, the voice that carried America through depression and war, died suddenly at Warm Springs. And Harry Truman, the man who had been kept outside the war rooms, outside the classified briefings, outside every major decision of the Roosevelt presidency, stepped into the Oval Office. He was welcomed with only one sentence: "Mr. President, the world is at war." But what Truman discovered in the hours and days that followed would shake him more than the war itself. He had not inherited a government. He had inherited a court built around Roosevelt, run by people who had lived, worked, and fought under FDR's shadow for more than a decade. They were loyal to Roosevelt's memory. They believed in Roosevelt's vision, and many of them quietly believed that no one, least of all Harry Truman, was worthy of replacing him. Truman felt it immediately: the guarded looks, the measured tones, the subtle comparisons to a man who could no longer defend himself. He was now the President of the United States. Yet the building around him still behaved as if the real president had just stepped out of the room. And before Truman could lead a nation at war, he would first have to confront something far more personal: the impossible legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In the days after Roosevelt's death, Truman attempted to settle into his new role, but the transition was unlike anything in American history. Roosevelt had been president for more than 12 years. His staff was loyal to him, sometimes fiercely so. Many had worked with Roosevelt since the Great Depression. They saw him as irreplaceable. To them, FDR hadn't simply been a president. He was a movement, a mission, a guiding intelligence behind America's most ambitious program and its darkest secrets. Truman, by contrast, had been vice president for just 82 days. In that time, he had been almost completely shut out of the wartime White House. Roosevelt had not invited him to strategy meetings. He had not given him access to the most confidential files. He had barely acknowledged him at all. When Truman first met with Roosevelt's senior advisors after assuming office, he expected support, orientation, a sense of camaraderie. Instead, he found a political aristocracy. These were advisors accustomed to Roosevelt's rhythm, accustomed to reading his mind, accustomed to shaping policy through personal relationships rather than institutional structure. They looked at Truman, a small-town senator from Missouri, a former haberdasher, a man without Roosevelt's schooling or pedigree, and saw not a president, but an interloper. During Truman's first cabinet meeting as president, several members openly referenced Roosevelt's preferences as if Truman were merely maintaining the seat for the real leader. Advisors continued to use phrases like, "Well, Franklin would have," or "the president believed," as if the Oval Office still belonged to their former chief. Truman was polite, he was respectful, but he felt the sting. He later wrote that in those early days, he felt like a man walking into a room full of people who had been talking about him a moment before he arrived. He didn't say it, but he understood what he had inherited: a government loyal to a legend, run by people who didn't believe a new president, even a legitimate one, had the right to change direction. Within weeks, the friction between Truman and Roosevelt's inner circle became impossible to ignore. The resistance wasn't overt, it wasn't insubordination. It was something more subtle, and therefore more damaging. It was the feeling that decisions had already been made before Truman entered the room. That crucial information was being delivered selectively. That staff members were evaluating him, judging him, measuring him against a man no one could match. Truman would ask for a detailed explanation of the Yalta agreements. He would receive a carefully curated summary that smoothed over the concessions Roosevelt had made to Stalin. He would ask about Roosevelt's health in the final months of his life. When had the decline begun? Who had known it? How had it been managed? And the people closest to FDR would respond evasively, reluctantly, uncomfortably. He later discovered that Roosevelt had been gravely ill for months, possibly years. Doctors, aides, and senior advisors had known. The public had not. Truman certainly had not. To him, the secrecy was more than an oversight, it was a betrayal. A man about to inherit the presidency had the right to know the truth, but no one had taken the responsibility to tell him. As Truman dug deeper into Roosevelt's final months, he realized another uncomfortable reality. The Roosevelt administration had been run through personal loyalty, not institutional continuity. There were handshake agreements, unwritten understandings, personal channels of communication known only to Roosevelt's closest associates. Without those people, much of Roosevelt's foreign policy existed only in memories and private notes. And those memories belonged to men and women who didn't believe Truman should alter a single one of those commitments. To them, preserving Roosevelt's legacy was more important than empowering Truman's presidency. Truman didn't need to hear the words spoken out loud. He felt them in every briefing, every cabinet meeting, every polite correction referencing how President Roosevelt preferred to do things. The message was clear. If Truman wanted to lead, he would have to confront the very machine he had inherited. The shift inside the White House did not begin with a dramatic firing or a slammed door. It began with a single realization that came to Truman late one night in the early summer of 1945, a realization he later described privately in his diary. I am responsible for the world, yet the world does not report to me. In those first weeks, Truman was flooded with intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, military memoranda, and urgent requests for decisions. But buried within that avalanche was something far more unsettling: the subtle fingerprints of Roosevelt's inner circle shaping, filtering, and sometimes softening the information before it ever reached him. Truman was not paranoid. He was observant, and he had spent his entire career navigating political machines, first in Missouri and later in the Senate. He knew when people were trying to steer him. He recognized the invisible hand of advisors who believed they were the guardians of FDR's legacy and that their duty was to prevent the new man from undoing the old master's vision. He read a military briefing one morning that recommended a specific policy toward the Soviets, one that sounded suspiciously like language Roosevelt himself had used at Yalta. Truman asked who drafted it. The answer: a team led by someone who had worked directly under Roosevelt for a decade. Truman shelved the report. The message was quiet, but unmistakable. If he wanted clarity, he would need new voices. And so he turned first to the man he trusted most, James F. Burns, a political heavyweight and one of the few Democrats who truly understood Truman's frustration. Burns had served in Congress, on the Supreme Court, in the Roosevelt administration, and had been closer to Roosevelt than Truman himself had ever been. But Burns also knew what it was like to be denied influence by Roosevelt's inner circle. Truman saw in Burns not just a friend, but a bridge, a connection to Roosevelt's world without the emotional baggage of loyalty to Roosevelt's memory. Burns told Truman exactly what no one else dared say: "You cannot run this government with Franklin's people. You must build your own." The advice was bold, maybe even dangerous, but it was the truth Truman needed to hear. And the first test of that truth came faster than expected. Because even as the war in Europe ended and Japanese surrender seemed imminent, a new threat was emerging, not on the battlefield, but in Washington itself. A quiet political struggle was forming inside the Democratic Party. On one side were the New Dealers, loyal to Roosevelt's social programs, emotionally attached to his worldview, and deeply suspicious of Truman. On the other side were the party realists, who believed Roosevelt's era had ended and that Truman should reshape the administration before foreign policy and domestic reconstruction spiraled out of control. Caught between these factions, Truman realized he had a narrow window to assert authority before FDR's legacy swallowed him whole. The first major departure was Francis Biddle, the Attorney General. Although he respected Biddle's intelligence and integrity, Truman recognized that Biddle was still operating as if Roosevelt were alive. Decisions came framed in terms of Roosevelt's philosophy. Legal opinions were shaped by assumptions rooted in the New Deal era. Truman needed a top law officer who spoke his language, not his predecessors. Biddle resigned with grace, but the shockwaves traveled far beyond the Department of Justice. Soon after, Frances Perkins, one of the most iconic figures in FDR's administration, found herself facing the same reality. Truman admired her accomplishments and her pioneering role as the first woman in the cabinet, but she was inseparable from Roosevelt's memory. Her loyalty to him was deep, genuine, and unwavering. In meetings, she continued to reference Roosevelt, how he handled labor unrest, what he would advise, his commitments to workers, as if he were still in the next room. When Truman privately told her he needed someone fully aligned with the new administration, she understood. It was painful, but she stepped aside. Henry Morgenthau Jr.'s departure was more tumultuous. Morgenthau had been a close friend of Roosevelt's, a man who helped design the New Deal and finance the war. He had expected to remain central to the post-war economic order, but Truman saw things differently. Morgenthau's policy positions were increasingly incompatible with Truman's vision for post-war recovery, especially his hardline stance on Germany's economic future. Their clash over the harsh Morgenthau Plan for Germany was the final straw. The two disagreed sharply on how to stabilize Europe and how to deal with the Soviet Union. Truman valued Morgenthau's expertise but needed someone more flexible, someone who could navigate a world that was rapidly shifting from the Great Depression mindset to the emerging Cold War. When Morgenthau was informed he would not continue, he left the White House visibly stunned. The newspapers framed it as Truman removing a pillar of Roosevelt's legacy. To Truman, it was simpler. He needed a Treasury Secretary he could trust. Someone aligned with the world he had to manage, not the world Roosevelt had left behind. The public did not know it yet, but a deeper storm was brewing beneath the surface. The emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union, still an ally in name but increasingly a rival in practice, required Truman to make swift, decisive choices based on intelligence he could trust. And that trust was not always present with Roosevelt's staff. Truman asked for a briefing on Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe. The summary he received was astonishingly optimistic. It downplayed Soviet aggressions, minimized concerns from American diplomats on the ground, and suggested that Stalin would honor every promise made at Yalta. Truman was skeptical. He asked for raw intelligence. When he compared the two documents, the differences were stark. Someone, somewhere, had softened the truth. Whether out of habit, ideology, or loyalty to Roosevelt's optimistic view of Stalin, the old guard had reshaped the intelligence to align with Roosevelt's worldview. Truman was furious, but more importantly, he was alarmed. He could not lead a nation heading into the Cold War, with advisors who filtered reality through the lens of a president who was gone. And so the wheel continued to turn. Edward Stettinius Jr., Roosevelt's Secretary of State, resigned after realizing that Truman was bringing in Burns to take over foreign policy. Stettinius had been a loyal diplomat, but he was closely tied to Roosevelt's personal style of international relations. Truman wanted clarity, not charisma. He wanted a system, not a network. Burns became his new Secretary of State. Inside the White House itself, Truman quietly restructured the staff. He replaced appointment secretaries, communications officers, and press liaisons, many of whom had long-standing personal ties to Eleanor Roosevelt or to the New Deal coalition. Truman did not remove them out of hostility. He removed them because they reported to the past, not the present. Even Admiral William Leahy, Roosevelt's closest military advisor, essentially the chairman of the entire wartime command structure, saw his influence shrink. Truman kept Leahy on out of respect and necessity, but began shifting decision-making power toward military figures he trusted: George Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower, Chester Nimitz. By the autumn of 1945, the pattern was visible to everyone paying attention. Truman was quietly, methodically, and confidently building a government aligned with his leadership. The newspapers began calling it the Truman shakeup, and some FDR loyalists whispered that the new president was dismantling Roosevelt's legacy, but Truman knew something they didn't. The world was changing faster than anyone realized. The Soviet Union was hardening its grip on Eastern Europe. Churchill was warning about an Iron Curtain. China was descending into civil war. America had used atomic weapons for the first time in history. The planet was reorganizing itself politically, militarily, and morally. Truman needed unity at the top. He needed honesty. He needed advisors who gave him unfiltered facts, not carefully curated versions of the truth designed to preserve Roosevelt's worldview. As 1945 turned into 1946, the transformation of the federal government accelerated. Truman appointed James Burns as Secretary of State, replacing Edward Stettinius Jr., who had been deeply embedded in Roosevelt's personal diplomatic style. Truman brought in Tom Clark as Attorney General, a man he trusted completely. He sought advisors who valued clarity, structure, and transparency, traits Truman demanded after years of Roosevelt's highly personalized, often secretive methods. This was not a rebellion against Roosevelt. It was a rejection of the idea that Roosevelt's way was the only way. Truman understood and respected Roosevelt's genius. But he also knew that Roosevelt's genius had created a government that functioned through relationships rather than systems, through personal charm rather than clear lines of authority. Truman, who had begun his career as a county judge and believed deeply in rules, order, and accountability, had no patience for a government built on unwritten traditions and personal loyalties. He wanted structure. He wanted predictability. He wanted honesty. And he wanted advisors who spoke to him directly, not through the imagined voice of the man who had come before. Roosevelt's people had been brilliant, dedicated, and indispensable to their president, but they had been his people. His style of leadership had shaped them. His methods had empowered them. Their loyalty was to him and the vision he carried. Truman needed his own circle, not out of ego, not out of insecurity, but because the presidency demanded unity, especially in the aftermath of a world war and the beginning tremors of a new geopolitical conflict with the Soviet Union. He began holding daily briefings, a practice Roosevelt had never followed. He reorganized communication channels, demanded consistent reporting, and forced agencies to provide him with summaries. Roosevelt had often allowed his inner circle to filter. Little by little, the machinery of government began to shift. Staffers stopped referencing Roosevelt's preferences. Advisors began tailoring their recommendations to Truman. Cabinet members understood they were working for a new president with new priorities. And as those priorities took shape, rebuilding Europe, deterring Soviet expansion, transitioning America from war to peace, it became clear that Truman was not merely filling Roosevelt's seat. He was steering the nation into a new era. By the end of 1946, the transformation was largely complete. The White House staff was new. The cabinet was almost entirely Truman's. The government that had once been a monument to Roosevelt had reshaped itself into a machine aligned with Truman's leadership. The process had not been quick. It had not been brutal. It had not been a purge driven by resentment or revenge. It had been the necessary evolution of a government transitioning from one extraordinary presidency to another, profoundly different one. Roosevelt had been a visionary who governed through intuition and charisma. Truman was a pragmatist who governed through discipline and clarity. Roosevelt charmed. Truman confronted. Roosevelt improvised. Truman demanded structure. And in the end, it was Truman's structure, not Roosevelt's charisma, that the post-war world required. He oversaw the end of the war in the Pacific. He approved the Marshall Plan. He helped found NATO. He navigated the first years of the Cold War. He led the country through one of the most consequential transitions in American history. He succeeded not because he imitated Roosevelt, but because he finally stopped trying to. The shadow lifted when Truman accepted that he would never be Roosevelt, and didn't need to be. History often remembers the clash between Truman and Roosevelt's old guard as a battle of personalities. But the truth is quieter and far more human. Truman had inherited a government built around a single, irreplaceable figure. He had been denied the tools a successor normally receives. And he had stepped into one of the most dangerous moments the world had ever known. He couldn't lead with borrowed authority. He couldn't depend on inherited loyalties. He couldn't govern in a dead man's shadow. So he rebuilt. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. Not to destroy Roosevelt's legacy, but to create a space where he could build his own. The United States did not get another Roosevelt. It got Harry Truman. And in the world that emerged after 1945, that was exactly what it needed.